What is a country? This is a talk that I did about 6 months ago before the Ukraine-Russian war, special military operation, whatever you want to call it, all the hostilities, all of the terrible things which have happened in Ukraine during the last 6 months. I made this and it was on the basis of what is a country, discussing why can these little areas of eastern Ukraine peacefully leave Ukraine and become part of Russia, is what seems to have happened. You can argue, disagree about whether the election, the vote, the referendum was a sham, whether it was manipulated or whatever. But what you can't really argue with is that there's a body of how many people, I don't know, what percentage of the people, I don't know, in that area of Ukraine that want to be part of Russia. That people have the right to self-determination and are bringing to. This is what I did 6 months ago. I had hoped at the time that all of this could have been resolved peacefully. Unfortunately, that has not happened. Anyway, here it is. Ukraine invasion, no invasion by the Ruskies. Got Prime Minister Boris Johnson rattling the old tin again, rattling the old sabre, saying exactly the same things that they've been saying. Gravity of the situation, blah, 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 blah. A security conference in Munich, and we can all think back to the 1930s and security and peace conferences that they had there and the outcomes. And he's saying basically that he doesn't know what President Putin's going to do, blah, blah, blah. And we've got to stand strong together. Yeah, we've got to stand strong, got to be together. And they're ramping up the numbers, because if you weren't frightened by 100,000 Russian troops in each of the days, they had a few thousand extra on just to ramp up the fear factor. So depending on who you look at, it's anywhere in the region of 130,000, 140,000, 150,000, whatever. The Americans are bigging up the numbers even more. The Ruskies still saying that we're not going to invade. What is all getting your Calvin Kleins in a twist about, and they're still going on about diplomacy and dialogue and blah, 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 blah. The whole top and bottom of it, to me, seems to revolve around two things. The first thing is, what is a country? And the second thing is security of people against aggression by other states, perceived or otherwise. So the first thing is, what is a country? Well, most people, and in the past, countries have predominantly groupings of people that share normally a language, and in the olden times tended to be a religion as well. So countries tended to be split down by language and religion. The religion is not so much anymore in most countries, because religion worldwide in Western countries sort of went down in numbers that believe that they're religious. The language, and for this example, Canada is a great example, whereby you've got the eastern part of Canada that speaks predominantly, and you've got the other provinces in Canada that overwhelmingly. There's been an ongoing, certainly in its present form, from the 1960s, where Quebec wants to become independent. It wants to maintain good links with the rest of Canada and the United States, but it wants to be able to determine a number of things: its own taxation, its own foreign policy, its own laws, and its own treaties. The problem comes is, how do you back out Quebec from Canada? And the easy way, you would think, is, well, you have a referendum, and if you get a majority of people to vote for the referendum, that you can then negotiate a backwardation, a reversal, out of Canada. And that sounds pretty easy and straightforward until you get the rest of the people in Canada. The agreement for the referendum's got to be done with all of the people in Canada. So the Parliament in Canada says, yeah, you can have a referendum. For it to stick, it's got to be the majority of the people. So you go, hang on a minute, this is not the majority of people, it's the majority of people. So it's got to be a majority of all of the people, not just a majority of the people that vote, which means your percentage of your vote has got to be higher, because obviously there's always going to be a percentage of the population that won't or don't or can't be bothered to vote. If you have 100 people in the country and only 60 of them decide to vote, then you would have to get 5/6, 50 out of those 60 to vote for independence. So you can see that that becomes also, when they were going through these sort of courts in Canada, if Canada is divisible, if Canada is divisible, then so is Quebec. And basically what that means is that, yeah, Quebec can exit from Canada and become its own country. Within Quebec, there's the Indian nations, the Cree, and the all part of the original Iroquois nations that were there before the European settlers got there in the 16 and 1700s. So the Indian nations are saying, you get a majority in Quebec to vote to take out of Canada, then we should be able to have a vote to take us and leave us in Canada. So just as Quebec, then the Indian nations that reside in Quebec can leave Quebec and rejoin whichever term you want to use, Canada. Now, if you apply this same to what's happening in UK Rain, none of this seems to be getting talked about. All I hear is saber rattling. All I hear is if you invade, then we're going to do economic sanctions, and these economic sanctions are going to be catastrophic, and it's going to be really, really bad for you, and blah, 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 blah. There's a number of things that come out of this. The first thing is nobody seems to be wanting to resolve the problem. And there's two problems. It's like an iceberg. There's the problems that you can see. The eastern part of UK Rain wants to either separatist and have its own little country, and it's really, really small. Realistically, it wants to back out of being in Ukraine, and it wants to go and join Mother Russia again. Because the borders in Ukraine have been reasonably fluid. Bits of Poland given to Ukraine, bits of it given to Romania. There's been chops and changes over the years. Obviously, the latest one, 2014, the people in Crimea having a referendum and deciding that they wanted to be part of Russia. You can argue whether Russia annexed it, put troops there, whether the election was valid or not valid. The outcome is the bulk of the people that live in Crimea consider themselves Russian. They voted. You can argue about whether the vote was legal, not legal, whether it was fairly carried out. The net result is that Crimea is part of Russia. There wasn't any real big kerfuffle about that. And the reason why countries break up, separate, and bits of them want independence, and in this case in Ukraine, is that the eastern side of Ukraine predominantly considers themselves Russian. They speak Russian as the language. The vast bulk, 3/4 of the Ukraine, speaks Ukrainian predominantly to a third, and it's basically all in the eastern bit where the majority of Russian speakers are. Since the last 5, 6, 7 years, there's been an ongoing rumble between the people that want to be part of Russia and secede, whatever term you want to use, and the rest of Ukraine. And the rest of Ukraine say, no, you cannot leave. And this is part of Ukraine. You lot can diddle off and go to Russia and live there, but the country can't. The country stays where it is. And this comes back to sovereignty. Who owns the country? Well, obviously you would say the people that own the land, they are the title holders. But who owns the country? Not just the land. Who owns the sovereignty? Is the sovereignty mutable? Can it change? Or is it fixed for all time? What happens when you get loads of immigrants like what happened in Canada. The Iroquois basically were the dominant force in that part of the world till the French settlers, the wars with the Indians, and then Britain came and the wars with Britain, and then the Treaty of Paris, blah, 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 in Canada ended up being a British territory. But the Indians, the Iroquois and stuff like that, they all got shunted out. So sovereignty is mutable because it's been proven by that. First it was the Iroquois that was sovereign, then it was the French that was sovereign, then it was the British that was sovereign, then it all got subsumed into like Greater Canada. So it's the same thing possibly with Ukraine. Why can't these bits in the east, if the majority of people that live there want to be part of Russia, why can't it be part of Russia? It's sovereignty. How do you define the sovereignty? Is it mutable? Has it got to be fixed? Are the borders always got to be fixed? Can you not redraw the borders based on what people want? But the iceberg, that's the one that you see. The other bit that you see is NATO. It's obvious that the Ukraine, the bulk of Ukraine, especially the Western is sliding ever closer to being part of the EU. It wants to join the Common Market stroke EU, stroke Union of Europe, European Union, wherever the name is this week for it. It wants to join that. And also it wants to join NATO. And herein lies the second part of the problem. The second part of the problem is that Russia sees NATO as a threat, and it would prefer to keep that threat at arm's length. Ukraine and Russia have a common border. If Ukraine joins NATO and NATO weapons into Ukraine, then Russia would tend to think that this is getting a little bit too close for comfort. There doesn't seem to be any method of negotiating this away. The Russians steadfastly say this is not what they want to happen, just like the Americans steadfastly said this is not what we want to happen, having missiles in Cuba. So what do we do? Do we go back and the Russians say, okay, you're going to put missiles in Ukraine, we'll put Russians in Cuba. Let's kick this off again. The bit of the iceberg which is under the water and which is sort of semi-talked about, but to my mind is the real and overriding reason for all this heightened talk about the Ukraine, is that it revolves around the Russian gas exports. The Americans' noses are being put out of joint. Europe continues to increase the amount of gas and oil that it gets from Russia. It's making the Russians a lot of money. It's tying to Russia financially and economically. Americans do not like this, as far as I can tell. The Americans want to be the kingpins. The Americans have bases throughout the world, a huge number of bases in a huge number of foreign countries. You've got to ask yourself the question, is all of this warranted? Is all of this necessary? What is NATO and why is NATO still ongoing, basically 70 years after WW2? It started off, obviously, as a counter Russia after WW2, when Russia had all of the satellite states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, sort of, all aligned with Russia, with also Germany split into Western and Eastern Germany, with the threat of possibly that Russia, for whatever reason, invade the rest of Europe. As far as I can tell, that was never, nothing like that ever came about. If you're an arms manufacturer in the West, then it's pretty good to have a bogeyman. And the bogeyman that the Western countries have used has been Russia all of the time. Russia, 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 Russia this, Russia that. Things have changed from the 1960s and the 1970s and the Berlin airlifts and the Berlin Wall and all of the rest of the stuff. Europe's a different place to where it was then. And so is Russia. I don't think Russia has any territorial ambitions. This is my personal opinion. It doesn't have any territorial ambitions on the rest of Europe. It certainly has territorial. There are parts of Ukraine which territorial have majority of Russians, and Russia kind of sees that those parts subsume and come back and be part of Russia. if the people in those areas want it to happen. The Americans via NATO, and let's be absolutely clear about this, is that NATO is America. It's just another word for it. The main countries in NATO are predominantly, by a huge margin, the United States. We've got the two countries with nuclear armaments that follow up, basically France and the United Kingdom. The rest of the countries have armaments, they have navies, they have bits of air forces. But predominantly, it's those three countries. NATO says that it's a defensive force. There's some margin ameliorating what that actually means. If you can come up with a good enough reason, you can be not a defensive, but an attacking force. And NATO forces have been in the former Yugoslavia, and they went down there. And they also, believe it or not, were defending by going across to Libya. Just as everything happens in governments, the government games the system for its own goods, just as NATO games the system. Its remit says it's defensive, but if you can come up and game the system and say, oh, humanitarian, off you go. You can go do whatever you want, anywhere you want, outside of Europe. NATO is basically what America wants to happen. The European Union, what it projects and likes to think of itself as being, then NATO would not need to exist. The European Union hides, in a certain respect, behind NATO. It hides behind the shield of American military capability. It doesn't take on that mantle for itself. The Germans are quite happy with that. It means they don't have to spend any money, in essence, on defence. They don't have to worry about being looked upon as being an aggressive nation. And they can hide behind that American shield, and that shield provided primarily by the French and the British in NATO. So Germany, although it's the economic powerhouse of Europe, can just stand behind. We don't have to spend any money. We can let these daft bastards send their troops to get killed anytime. The other countries like Holland and Belgium, Luxembourg and Portugal and Spain and Denmark and these sort of places just pay lip service to it, in my opinion. America will help us out if we get invaded, but being realistic, we never need to do anything. We never need to send troops. We never need to get involved in anything. Just leave it up to the daft froggies and the daft Brits and the daft Yankees. They can sort that out. So the bottom part of the iceberg is the Nord Stream 2, is the gas pipeline. And this, to my mind, is the real reason why the Americans are making such a big kerfuffle about Ukraine. Do the Americans care that there's a little sort of civil war going on in the east of Ukraine? I don't personally believe so. I don't think they give a jot about any other countries, but they won't. The Nord Stream 2, Russia supplying more to Europe. Germany shutting down its nuclear plants. Germany has a requirement for more energy. Russia is close by comparatively and can supply basically as much gas as Germany will ever need for as long as it needs it. The Russian gas supplies are immense. The Russians want to supply more gas. The Russians are commercialized in that respect. They want to sell as much gas as they can. The Russians have a little bit of an ongoing tiff with the Ukrainians over the tariff. In the present time, it's somewhere in the region of $2,000 million a year that the Russians pay in tariff fees for transiting the gas through Ukraine. Now, obviously, that's a huge amount of money. If you don't have to pay those transit fees, that's all additional profit. That's all money that you can make. This is Nord Stream 2, one of the reasons why. This links up Russia to Germany direct, and it doubles basically the capacity of Nord Stream 1 that exists in there. The Americans don't like that. Americans don't want the Germans and the Ruskies to get chummy. It doesn't suit America's interest. It also doesn't suit America's interest because the gas contracts throughout the world are normally done in US dollars. If the Germans and the Russians decide that we've got a long-term deal here for the next 30, 40, 50 years. Why don't we do it in German euros? The Russians, I would imagine, would be fine with that. That cuts the American dollar system a little bit. It means the Germans don't need dollars to buy the gas. It means the Russians don't have to get shot of dollars once they've got them. It means they can trade in euros. Americans aren't too keen about anybody doing world trade in anything but dollars. It gives the Americans an absolute huge advantage over every other country in the world. The Americans can print more dollars. Other countries have to buy dollars if they want to buy commodities on the world stage. If you want to buy copper, iron ore, the majority of those, and especially oil and gas, are all traded in US dollars. There's a demand for US dollars, which is immense for all of these commodities. The Americans are scared, don't want to happen. This chipping away of the American dollar being used for world trade. If that gathers momentum, all of the gas that goes to Europe is done in euros. The Norwegian gas that comes to Europe, oh, why not we just pay you that in euros as well? It weakens the American dollar and it strengthens the euro, because the euro countries can print just like the Americans can print dollars. The euro countries can print euros. It makes the euro, it makes the dollar. To my mind, this is the real reason. The rumble in Ukraine is an excuse that the Americans are using, and they've got their European lackeys, basically Britain, running around like a barking little terrier dog, yapping about this aggression and that aggression, and there's going to be all these economic sanctions, blah, 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 blah. We've got the European Union basically mouthing the same stuff, but realistically, do they care? I'm not too sure. What the European Union is based on is continuous and increasing the size of the EU. This is one of the reasons why over the last couple of years, the Europe has been faltering, because it's been based on the premise of ever increasing the size of the population. The markets got bigger, more countries are brought in. Ukraine, 40 odd, 50 million people, wherever. If they join the EU, that'll be a big step up for them. More cheap food from Ukraine, a lot of technology companies based out there. And obviously on the horizon, you've got Turkey. At the present time, there's no way Turkey, the EU, not with the state of the economy, and not with the state of the democracy across the rest of the countries, and not just stand for it. Even though economically they would love to have them in, politically they're scared about letting them in. So that's my take. My take is that this is just saber rattling at the request of the Americans. Britain's doing its normal run around at the bequest of the Americans. Britain has no real interest, as far as I can tell, in Ukraine. Most of the European countries don't. If the eastern part of Ukraine secedes and these couple million people or whatever leave the Ukraine, join Russia, won't make one iota of difference to the bulk of the people in Europe or the United States. Won't make a big difference. It's a line on a map that changes just a couple of inches one way or the other. Those people come out of Ukraine, that land's no longer Ukraine, and it just moves across. Nice and peaceful. Have a referendum, decide on the outcomes. That's my take. Nord Stream 2, American dollar, that's what it's all about. Arrivederci.